Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv. Back with another conversation episode. Now, you might have noticed that Tuesday this week was a conversation episode, and that was on purpose because, the book that it was referencing, The White Pedestal, all about classics and white supremacy. If you can believe it, that was recorded a while ago. But that book came out on Tuesday. Do we all know what Tuesday was? In any case, Tuesday had to be a conversation because it was simply too appropriate. And then this week progressed. And it became more appropriate. So today I am back with another episode, another conversation. This time I spoke with Joshua Cannon, who teaches various topics in classics, has a background really specifically, though, in Hittites, which is the ancient peoples of the Anatolia, Trojan, Troy generally area. And so we talked a lot about that. But specifically, Josh has written a book called The Fatal Second Helen, and it is a book about the Iliad and war from the perspective of a veteran. And now that's something I was a little bit hesitant about as a Canadian who is 37 years old and has been paying attention. I'm really cautious of anything to do with the American military for a lot of really good reasons. But I was so interested in the way that coming at this as somebody who has actually been in war in that way is really interesting. And he's coming at it from a way that really emphasizes what we have talked about on the show before and how the Iliad is anti-war. And when it is read as pro-war, there's some kind of disconnect that needs connecting. And I think it's really important. And we talked a lot about that, but we also talked a lot about just the Hittites and actually the Sumerians as well, and the ways in which the Iliad is also a continuation of all of other war epics from those civilizations, those groups. And so it's just a really interesting way of looking at the Iliad and war. And this was recorded 3 months ago. So I didn't know how relevant it was going to be, but I think it's better timing than ever because the US seems to want to go to war again with everybody. And so I don't know. This week has been kind of wild. And I also I do want to say, because I think it's really appropriate in this introduction, so I apologize for how long it's going, but I got a comment or a message today from a man who was so angry about how much I bash white men. Called me a lot of great names. If you're interested, you can see a dramatic reading on Instagram, because at the very least, his top tier levels of misogyny and abuse were funny, primarily. Because when men use being child free and owning cats as an insult, you gotta laugh, because living my dream, boys. It's fine. And so I just think it's really appropriate to reference that because, on Tuesday I talked to a white man about white man problems, and today I'm talking to a white man about white man problems. So let's just all remember that generalizing a group of people who, as a group, do all the most terrible things doesn't actually mean that you entirely hate that group. And actually, I think it's really important to be bringing white men into this, because white men need to be the ones to solve the problem with white men. And so today we have a really fascinating conversation that looks at that. And so it's a good reminder that not all bears, but all bears have the potential. conversations. The only ones who benefit from war are the bad guys. A Veteran's Iliad with Joshua Cannon. Basically wanted to start by just introducing what you've been working on and how, I mean, it relates to Homer, which is why Michaela and I were like, this sounds great. We always want to hear Homeric anything. I'm deep in the Odyssey right now, so my Iliad is a little rusty, so you'll have to hold us up there. But what got you, or I guess, can you tell me about your background first, because you're a professor of classics, right? And sort of like how you got into that, maybe? Or
happily. Yeah. So I work at the University of Pittsburgh, and my real job is I'm the director of research for the Frederick Honors College, and that just means I help undergraduate students find research opportunities. That's the easiest way to explain that. I do teach for the classics department and the anthropology department, but those are on an adjunct status, and so I usually teach one or two classes for each of those departments a semester. And this semester I'm teaching ancient epic, which
well,
I am just loving. Yeah, very appropriate for what we're going to talk about today. And I'm having the class read, or we've already read Gilgamesh, and we're almost done with the Iliad, and then we're going to read the Aeneid. Prior to coming to Pitt to work for the Frederick Honors College, I was at University of Chicago, and I got my PhD in Near Eastern languages and civilizations, which is the name of that department, with a focus on Anatolian archaeology, the archaeology of Turkey.
Cool. Yeah.
And my research was on the Hittites, whom I find just still are wonderfully fascinating. And what I think is valuable about that background is I took a lot of classics courses as an undergraduate, but then I switched. I mean, it's not like a very big switch, but I switched over to Near Eastern Studies as a grad student.
It's different enough, but in a meaningful way. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, so I look at the Iliad from the East, right? Like I contextualize it with the Hittites and the Luwians and the different peoples that were around there, and I read all these now. Of course, classicists read Near Eastern Studies scholars all the time too, so there's nothing. It's not truly unique, but I would say I'm probably a fair bit more versed in what we think about the Hittites and scholarship on the Hittites than a typical classicist. Now, there's some classicists who are just good at everything, and they've got us all beat. And then the other little wrinkle I like to think is I'm an archaeologist, right? So I've translated ancient Greek and Hittite. I've studied Hittite and Akkadian, so I'm certainly familiar and spent time with languages. Nothing like other people like Joel Christensen, right? That guy knows ancient Greek. He's probably got the Iliad memorized.
Honestly, the way he can just spout it out at the drop of a hat, I am perpetually shocked.
So I would never, ever even think about comparing myself to scholars like him. But because I'm a materials person and not as much a text person, I like to think that gives me some new ways. Not new. Plenty of archaeologists have written about the Iliad. I'm not the first by any stretch, but I like that I'm coming at this text with some less traditional background and a less traditional background in education, and I'm thinking about it in less traditional ways. And then, of course, the last piece that comes into all of this is I was in the United States Marine Corps from 2000 to 2005. I was part of the invasion in 2003. I went back to Iraq in 2004, and I served over there as an Arabic linguist. So they sent me in 2000, they sent me to school. I studied Arabic for a year and a half at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. And September 11th happened while we were halfway through our Arabic program. And so we were like, oh, shoot, this is pretty relevant to what we're going to be doing. And indeed, it was very relevant. And so the book that I wrote, Fatal Second Helen, A Modern Veteran's Iliad, that book is my perspective on the Iliad as a combat veteran and an archaeologist and a long time Iliad fan.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit of a mouthful. It's a little bit difficult to get that all into one sentence. So often what I do is I stick with, I think, what is probably the most distinctive part is it is my perspective on the Iliad as a combat veteran, and I'll, full stop. But there's a lot more to it than that. And the veteran piece, I think, allows me, or has allowed me, to look at some of the attitudes and behaviors in the Iliad and say, we're still doing that, and
Yeah.
that's not good.
Yeah.
It was a problem back then, whether Trojan War really happened or it didn't, or
Yeah.
in the time when this is all getting written down and people are thinking, oh, this Achilles guy he's a pretty good guy. Like, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Whatever time period you want to place those cultural attitudes about combat and masculinity and violence, some of those attitudes are still around, whether it's a direct continuation from that time period or it's something about Homo sapiens or something about men or something about violence. I'm not exactly sure what the underlying variables are, and I'm not even necessarily too worried about that, I suppose. I'm just interested in reading and I'd read the Iliad. I taught the Iliad multiple times before I wrote this book. But when I read the Iliad for this book, I just really gave it the closest read I'd ever given it. And I used Emily Wilson's incredible translation
Yeah.
that just came out in 23. And that helped a lot too, because I'd read Lombardo and I'd read Lattimore and Fagles. Right, I'd read the standard Fitzgerald, read the kind of the standard versions, and I liked it. I'm a sucker for Lattimore because he's so literal. Anyone out there, if you want the most literal translation of the Iliad, like the word for word, this is what the ancient Greeks are trying to say, then Lattimore is clearly your person. And Lattimore, by doing that, saves himself from looking like what would be a good, like a chauvinist, because any chauvinism in there is already in the Greek.
Yeah. Versus like the translational issues that plague a lot of other translators. Yeah.
And Emily Wilson, so she came to the University of Pittsburgh in 2019 and gave a talk, and I got to meet her, and we went in the classics department, took her out to dinner. So I got to sit next to her husband, and it turns out her husband and I grew up in the same county of Pennsylvania.
That's cute.
So Greene County, Pennsylvania, random detail, but I got to see her talk about her. That was when she had translated the Odyssey. I got to see her talk about her translation choices, and obviously she's like, a lot of my predecessors were not A, doing Homer justice, or B, doing the women in the Odyssey justice.
Yeah.
And so her voice, A, because she's just a brilliant human being, but B, because she too is bringing a perspective that Fagles and Lombardo and Lattimore did not bring, is so exciting and welcome. And it was so I had the idea for my book in my head for years, and I'd written a couple chapters and I'd outlined a couple more, and I was like, oh, I should definitely talk about this. I should share this story. But I think I was subconsciously waiting for like the right provocation, the right, and it was Emily Wilson's translation of her Iliad.
Yeah.
Because she announced it. Well, she had been talking about it, I think, shortly after she published the Odyssey.
Yeah, if it was long running, I think I was like not at all patiently waiting for a long time.
Yes. Well, she was dripping these little tidbits through Twitter, and I gobbled them up. Like, I was, oh my gosh, she put another line up. And then she switched over to Substack, and I don't think she's for obvious reasons. She was like, Twitter's not for me anymore, or X, I should say.
I miss old Twitter.
Yeah. And so she went over to Substack, and I was reading her stuff on Substack. I haven't looked at it recently, but I don't know that I've seen anything from her. But that publication, which came out, I want to say the fall of 23 or maybe late summer of 23.
Yeah.
I was like, that's it. That's the impulse that I'm going to have to finish this book. So I pre-ordered a copy of her book. It showed up in the mail like as early as it possibly could. I just read it like I was starving, and started writing my book. And I had it's not a very long book. I have it right here actually, which I know the audience can't see this or won't see this, but It's only 180 pages. And so I was able to write it in like, I think it was like 5 or 6 months. And part of it, because a lot of it was already in my head. I'd already written
Yeah.
some chapters. And I sat down with her translation and I just read it as closely as that was a majority of the couple of months, was just how slowly I was reading this. And she was able to help me. I think her translation was able to help me think about it differently and much more closely. And like I said several minutes ago, say, oh, this book is saying some things that I missed the first several times that I read it. And I like it even more now because I understand it better. And I think that it's even more intelligent than I once thought long ago. And so I was really excited to write about that kind of newer reading that I was able to have, and to say my reading of this is very much enabled by my past and the things that I've seen. Um, and then I wrote it all down so other people could try to get a piece of it.
No, I mean, I know exactly what you mean with just that feeling of reading the translation that sort of refreshes like your love for the thing. I think that's just a great reminder. I mean, with my listeners, a lot of them are coming to this world from like no, academic background. And so I get asked a lot about translations but mostly like, why a translation really can make the difference. And I think that's just such a good description. Like one of the reasons why a translation makes a difference. Like if you were to pick up whatever terrible public domain translation, you find at a thrift shop, like versus one that you've, sort of more thought through or looked into or whatever, like you're just going to get it such a different experience. So I love that hers exists now, because I think it just makes a big difference to have that, and just the way she's talked about it too, because like you were talking about the Odyssey parts, this conscious representation of women in a more like I won't even say positive light, just like true to the sources light,
Yeah.
It's so interesting. But obviously the way you come at it, with your background, which one I have to say, like the Hittite stuff is so interesting to me. And I think having your background knowledge based in that realm does provide this like just a different look at it, because you're obviously like, you're coming at it from the culture that we ascribe to the quote unquote Trojans, right? That the Hittite people were more likely than not the ones that the Greeks would have been writing about in that realm. And it's really interesting to be coming at it from that side, especially when you think about the Iliad and how it's also unique in that like the Greeks are not the good guys, really. It's not about good guy versus bad guy. And you mentioned Joel Christensen earlier, and he was on the show recently enough. I forget when, time is a flat circle, but he was on recently enough that we were talking about the Iliad, and one of the things we had been wanting to look at for a while is just the ways that it's used today by people to like, I mean, just to uphold these like really terrible colonial patriarchal pro-war, just like this nonsense. And they want to, usually people try to pick that out of the Iliad, or they like present it in this kind of way. And I'm always fascinated in how it's used that way and kind of picking that apart. And so I imagine coming at it from somebody who was involved in a war like that, which, I mean, it's also, I hope you don't mind me saying, but like there's something to be said for like the type of war that, and a comparison to the Iliad too, in that way of just sort of, I mean, not to put it overly bluntly, but a war just for the sake of a war, right? And sort of these, whatever else goes along with it. But yeah, so like, I mean, I don't even know what kind of questions to ask, I guess, but it must have been a very interesting way of looking at it. And I guess maybe tell me kind of where you landed or what you've looked at in that kind of way. Yeah. Terrible question, yeah, well, but I think you get it.
No. I'm following you. Oh, definitely. I'll actually start with, I don't know if this is exactly what you meant when you said type of war, because yeah, the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Troy land and the invasion of Iraq, both very problematic in a variety of ways.
Yeah, I more mean the here's a reason for us to go to war. Here it is.
Yeah.
Just
yeah. And it's not economic at all. Don't worry about
no,
economic pieces.
It's definitely not. It's this thing that is definitely a good enough reason to cause this much damage.
Right.
Yeah.
That phrase "type of war" that actually was one of the early questions I had in my head was kind of what did Homer get right? Does the Iliad show us things about war that are accurate? And obviously, I know you've talked about this on your podcast before. Jonathan Shea and his Achilles of Vietnam, brilliant piece of work that says yes, Homer got some things right, and here they are. But his is obviously very psychological, right? And the moral injury and bad leadership and difficult choices. I was a little bit more curious about, does the Iliad say anything about war that is accurate in terms of how war was conducted, not how it made people feel, but how it was actually conducted? And I thought about that archaeologically. I thought about that from my experience. And I thought about Alexander the Great. And, he is so excited about Achilles, and he's the new Achilles. And I have taught about Alexandrian, or about Hellenistic warfare. And I'm like, what is this about? Alexander the Great's style of war is nothing like the Iliad. And the closest that I would argue that you could come to is he is very dashing and very brave, and he's leading cavalry charges into the Persian line. And I mean, Achilles never rode a horse as far as we know, but obviously he was in a chariot. So it's, there's some connection there, but I don't think we have any examples of Alexander the Great using chariots in warfare. Maybe in ceremonies or whatnot, we know that we know the chariots were still used in some circumstances. But I was just fascinated by the fact that Alexander the Great read the Iliad and was like, "That's me." I'm like, "No, that's not you at all. It's so different. It's entire. It's not." It's not a bunch of princes and kings who are armored fighting each other and kind of in the back. I mean, Homer barely gives us anything about this, but you have to imagine in the background, there's like all these other people who are not royalty, who are not armored. And I tell my students, I'm like, we don't know. Wilson translated as the common men. We don't know what they were fighting with. It's never explained. So I'm like, there wasn't, bronze was very expensive. So they're maybe they have a spear because it's, a little bit of bronze at the end of a spear tip, but maybe also they've got sharp sticks and like big stones or something. We don't actually know what weaponry the hoi polloi, the common folks would have been using. Whereas obviously in Hellenistic warfare, Alexander's battles, he's got this middle class, well armored hoplite, heavy infantry folks. So it's just so. I mean, obviously the Greeks loved to depict heroes from the Iliad as hoplites. We see that in vase painting almost every single time, unless it's the heroic nude, which is
I was going to say naked hoplites. Yeah. There's a lot of naked hoplites. They've got like the armor of a hoplite, or the like a shield and a helmet and everything, but nothing else. I've been having to look at a lot of pottery for the Odyssey, and
yeah. So yeah, in the Greek mind, probably, I mean, hoplites were just, we obviously don't know exactly when the Iliad was written or if Homer even existed, but the general idea is 700 BC, 650 BC. So hoplites are around already at that point. So it makes sense that Homer, if that's the author, or if that's indeed the poet, and his audience were visualizing in this way. But we know archaeologically that, that type of armor. I mean, yes, bronze armor existed in the late Bronze. So if the Trojan War happened, it probably happened around 1200 BC, give or take a decade or so. And yes, bronze armor, a boar's tusk helmet, or boar's tooth helmets, these things existed, but they had to be so tremendously rare. They're exceptionally rare in the archaeological record, which doesn't necessarily mean they were rare in real life, because people would have grabbed up that bronze and reused. I mean, metal would have been so valuable back then. So because we don't find it frequently in the archaeological record is not an indicator of how rare it actually was in real life, but it would have been exceptionally rare. And so if we either using kind of a hoplite style of warfare that Homer may have envisioned, or a more accurate late Bronze Age style warfare that we know that the Hittites practiced, certainly neither of these things look. Well, I guess the hoplite style warfare looked a little bit like Alexander in terms of armor, but not in terms of actual battle tactics, right? So he's got his hoplites with their sarissas, and they're just walking towards the army, and they're just kind of poking them with these massive spears, and if they get close enough, they're going to hack them. And they're just, these heavy infantry hoplite troops, they're just, I tell students, like, they're the anvil that doesn't budge, that is just always going to be there, and that the enemy army can't really do much to. And then you've got Alexander with his cavalry just waiting for the right time to attack. And then something breaks in the Persian line, or something happens, and Alexander swoops in like a lightning bolt, and all of a sudden the Persians are in trouble, right? Nothing like what the Iliad tries to show us. And so I think that's very fascinating. And then, of course, I can take that way up into modern era, and I can say, well, it's very different once again, right? Because nobody has swords or shields or arrows. Yeah, we have projectiles, we have bullets and missiles and other terrible things like that, but it's very different again. And so in terms of actual two individuals fighting with one another, it's changed tremendously. And that goes without saying. So I didn't really spend time on that. But what I did spend some time on was, okay, let's not necessarily worry too much about how one-on-one or one army versus another army's combat tactics have changed, but let's talk about some attitudes that we see. And so one of the observations that I make about Achilles, and I'm definitely not the first person to make this observation, but I might be the first person to make it using modern military terminology. In the Marine Corps, and I don't know as much for other services, although I believe this is true, there is a term for somebody like Achilles, and there's a couple different ways to say it: Bravo Foxtrot, Blue Falcon, or the best is Buddy Fucker. And it's what you say of another service member who abandons his fellow service members. It's what you say of somebody who lets you down, who doesn't have your back, right? And so being called a Bravo Foxtrot, Blue Falcon, I think, is the most common way that I heard it said. Being called that is like that hurts. That's bad. Nobody wants that, right? And I write in my book that Achilles is the biggest buddy fucker, the biggest Blue Falcon in literature. I mean, this guy knowingly, and not just knowingly, but actually has his mother arrange for Greek death.
Oh yeah,
because his pride has been hurt. And so I spend a lot of time talking about, well, just think about how terrible that is, that this guy, had his feelings hurt, had his pride pricked, and he's like, well, I want all my buddies to die. No, not all, but I want enough of my buddies to die that they beg me to come back. And when they do come to beg him to come back in book 9 in the embassy scene, he says no. Right. And then the next day, it all goes to hell for the Greeks, and he's got to send Patroclus out. Patroclus asks, because Patroclus is a good guy.
Yeah.
Patroclus asks to be sent out. And then Achilles kind of gets what he deserves for being a Blue Falcon, and his buddy and his best friend dies, a person whom he loves. Whether, romantically or not, obviously the Iliad, I think the Iliad, I argue that the Iliad, it's very subtle, but the Iliad is kind of saying, they were lovers.
Me too. It's like, it's indirect, but it's also like, if you can read between any little line, like, yeah.
Well, the thing that pushed me off the fence was back to the embassy scene, when Phoenix is telling the story of Meleager and Cleopatra. And Cleopatra is the wife of I think it's Meleager. I'm always paranoid about my pronunciation.
No, that name is tough. I would say Meleager. Yeah, I just try to hit all the letters, the syllables.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So Phoenix is this old man who was once Achilles' mentor in his youth, and he is sent as part of this embassy for that reason, for that personal connection. And he tells Achilles the story of Meleager and Cleopatra. And Meleager leaves his fellow warriors behind, and Cleopatra talks him into going back, right?
I
And
forgot that that was her
Cleopatra,
name. Yeah, I forgot
yeah,
that that was the name, because now I'm like, well, I see where you're going with this.
yeah, right, right. So Cleopatra, the wife of Meleager, the warrior who was talked back into battle, is not an inversion, but it is the reverse of Patroclus's
Yeah,
name, right? They're
it
the same
means
name,
the
just
same thing.
ordered
Yeah.
different, meaning the same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, that's
Yeah. It's
that's
because
a
it's
pretty big coincidence.
it's like almost like saying just like it's the feminine version. Like, I know it's not
Yes,
it directly, but like it, yeah, that's like a clear like,
yeah.
okay, it's just the same name. Yeah.
So we, the audience, as well as Achilles, are told this story, and while it's happening, Patroclus is serving everybody food, which is not a male warrior thing to do.
Yeah, no.
And so it's like, hey, if you didn't get the reference to Cleopatra,
Here's
let me
the
give it to
other.
you. Let me give it to you another time. And then the other piece of it is, to the best of our knowledge, Patroclus did not go to Troy with armor, right? He goes to help he wants to go help the Greeks, but he doesn't have a suit of armor to do it, so he has to borrow Achilles's, right? And so it's like, well, so you're a full grown male. I don't know how old. He's supposed to be older than Achilles, and Achilles is very young. So let's call him a 30-year-old. Well, no, well, obviously, math logic doesn't work in Greek mythology, so I'll drop that line of thinking. But you're a fully grown male, and you went to war without armor. Well, okay, you must not have been anticipating going into battle, or maybe the other idea is, well, his armor was junky, and Achilles' armor is great, so he took the better armor. But
Yeah.
I'm
I
fascinated. Yeah, please.
sorry, is it not I've maybe this is one of those moments where, there are so many like modern adaptation kind of readings that I wonder whether it's that or in the text. But is it not that he's like trying to make himself look like Achilles? It is that he doesn't have his own armor at all.
Well, the Iliad doesn't tell us if he has
Okay.
armor or not. My
Okay.
assumption is that he doesn't.
Yeah.
When he goes to Achilles to say, "I really want to help the Greeks," Achilles says, "Okay, take my armor, take my myrmidons, take
Right.
take the
Okay.
men, and go do it." And Hector immediately recognizes him as Patroclus, not
Mm.
as Achilles. So, I'm trying to remember if Sarpedon uses his name. I think he does. So I think it's
Yeah.
unambiguous
Great.
that
No, I
that
think
it
that
is
might be
not Achilles.
some weird
Yeah.
modern thing that got in my head and it's been too long since I've read the Iliad. But that's
Well,
extra
no, this,
interesting.
yeah, these are like really, really tiny specific
Oh, I
details.
know.
And like I said, I could be wrong. Maybe everyone was like, oh no, of course Patroclus had armor. It's just that Achilles is so much better.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is more likely that he didn't have armor, which is
Yeah.
one more layer of, oh, this guy's not here to fight,
Yeah.
right?
No,
This
but the
guy, if he wants to
serving
fight,
the serving the food when
yeah,
that story is being told,
yeah.
that is delightful.
It's just like, so there's moments in Homer where he doesn't seem to be very clever or subtle. He's like, and then this guy got stabbed through the throat and the sword came out of his mouth.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh
Like,
yeah.
sometimes he's just given us straight up detail, and and the point of it is, oh, that's gory, or that's
Oh yeah.
intense, or
He'll
that's
be
a
like, there's
terrible
an
way to die.
eyeball on the end of the spear. Like,
Yeah.
the stuff that is in there is incredible.
But then he slows it down, and he has Patroclus serving the meal. That I think it precedes, but yes, in the same situation, the same moment
Mm-hmm.
where we're getting the story about Meleager and Cleopatra. So it's like, oh, that's clever. Or another. I don't know if it's my favorite scene in the Iliad, but it is easily the one that makes me choke up the most easily. I want to say it's book 23, but Achilles is sitting on the beach, and he's just buried. I want to say that I'm getting these details right.
Mm.
He's just buried Patrick. And for those of you that know the Iliad better than me, I apologize. Even though I just wrote a book about it, I might have a couple details wrong here. But the point is, Achilles is on the beach and he's missing Patroclus, and the ghost of Patroclus comes to him,
Mm.
and they have a really short conversation. And Achilles reaches out to touch Patroclus, and he's already gone because he's a ghost. And I was like, oh, Homer, wow.
Yeah.
you know how to touch the heartstrings. That little probably 15 to 20 line of Homeric poetry scene is so burned into my brain now because I felt it so hard when I read it. And then, of course, there's the Priam scene in his tent. That's
Mm-hmm.
obviously super touching. And so it's fascinating to me that there are, and again, when I teach the Iliad, I'm like, you got to go looking, right? There's these little kernels of like deep emotion and brilliant storytelling and not clear, but subtle, I suppose, arguments that Achilles and Patroclus probably are lovers. I'm not going to straight up say it, but let me feed you these little crumbs that say, oh boy, the burden of proof is on someone that would want to say otherwise now.
Yeah. I mean, well, even like, and not to make it about this, but I do also love the argument. But like, then we get to the Odyssey where, Odysseus meets them in the underworld, and
Mm,
Patroclus is just like with Achilles for the whole thing. And then we also learn that they're like buried in the same urn.
mhm.
And then, I mean, if you really go into the argument, and then you're like, well, in Plato's Symposium, they're not debating whether or not Achilles and Patroclus were lovers. They're just debating which role each of them served. Like, and then it's
Mhm.
just so funny to now hear people be like, they were absolutely not. And it's like, even Plato wasn't fighting it. It was just like he wanted the
Yeah.
details, you know? Like,
Well, and we can go back to Alexander the Great, who I'm not sure was nearly as homophobic as some people are today, but I don't know that Alexander the Great cared.
yeah.
Right?
Oh,
That's
no.
not what he read the Iliad for.
No.
He read the Iliad because when Achilles turns it on, it is pretty exciting. It's an action movie,
Yeah. Well, and what
and
I take from that is just simply that, like, because it was so normal for men to have relationships like that in that realm,
mhm.
that it's just kind of not the point, which is just sort of interesting now in the world of homophobia that we live in.
Yeah, and yeah, so that's a really interesting observation. Is Homer not making it black and white because he doesn't need to, or is he not making it black and white because maybe it would be, I don't know, it would be a little controversial for Achilles to be either homo or bisexual, probably bisexual, I suppose. um I couldn't speak to that. I mean, what I can say is I'm thinking through my knowledge of Greek mythology here. Do we have overt homosexuality in Greek mythology? And I don't know that I can think of an example. It's pretty hetero.
No, well,
um
like Apollo has a lot of boyfriends, and Heracles. There's
oh
definitely,
yeah.
but just in the there, they can always not Apollo. I mean, most of them can usually be linked to like pederasty,
Hmm.
making those connections. But no, and but or like in the case of Apollo and some of other gods who do definitely have like pretty explicit gay relationships, they always end with like the god's lover dying. I've had a lot of
Yeah.
conversations about also like what that can mean, and whether it's like this because it didn't fit with pederasty, it had to result in a death. And like there's so much to be said. It's certainly not to imagine that there was some like, perfect gay realm of ancient Greece where everyone was happy. It's just a matter of like such different attitudes and like how that ended up, and of course, and the pederastic relationships, where it's a whole other can of worms. But it's just an
Sure.
interesting kind of argument to within the mythology. But it's something that I've covered a handful of times with varying levels of success.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, another it's not exactly related, but I think it's a good or an interesting topic to debate. Did Helen go to Troy on her own free
Hmm.
will, or was she abducted? And again, Homer doesn't tell us. I mean, Homer gives us Helen, um, calling herself dog faced, right, at the Tychoscopia, at the view from the walls in
Hmm.
book 2. And so, or yeah, book two, sorry. Or no, or is it book three? Oh man, I'm
it's
finding
fine.
all types of holes in my game right now. But
I mean, you know the scene. You don't have to know the exact book.
yeah,
It's
right.
fine.
I'll just call it the Tychoscopia. But and so she clearly has. Well, I shouldn't say clearly, because Emily Wilson, so this is another example of the chauvinism that can come through in translation. I'm trying to remember who it was. Another male translator, not Lattimore, I don't think, has Helen saying "slut that I am," right, in reference to being at Troy at the Tychoscopia, and Wilson goes with a dog face that I am, it's actually I think it's actually dog eyed, but I think she goes with dog face.
I feel dog face is definitely like an insult that I know it's in the Odyssey too, and I remember reading her notes on it because she has some interesting arguments about that. And I mean, I know people also just like translate it as bitch because of the female dog nature, but then she had some interesting arguments against that as well, and how it wasn't necessarily meant to be an insult in the same way. I don't know.
Well, it's also what Achilles calls Agamemnon in book one, right? So bitch, right there, bitch. I mean, I'm Helen is feminine and Agamemnon is masculine, so maybe you could argue for bitch, but I like that Wilson chose a much more literal translation. And I can't remember if it was in the notes of her Iliad or if it was in another piece, kind of a popular media piece. She talks about that choice of going with dog face, and she says, "What are we to think about Helen's use of this phrase here? Is it?" She's this really clever discussion where she's like, is this what she thinks of herself? Or is this what she thinks other people think of her? And I love that she introduces that idea that Helen has enough depth to her that she could be saying, well, you all think I'm dog face, so I'll just go with that. But obviously I don't necessarily agree. And then again, related, when Menelaus beats Paris in their duel, that is book three, and Aphrodite saves Paris and whisks him away and takes him to his bedroom. And then she goes to Helen and says, Helen, go get in there with him. Helen shows up and she's making fun of him, right? But then they have sex and you're like, well, they are the two most beautiful people in the world. So it's like, but the fact that Helen is kind of disdainful of Paris when he arrives in her bedroom, it's like, I love that. She's making fun of this guy just a little bit, and clearly doesn't have a super high opinion of him. And again, I don't remember the exact Homeric language. We should get Joel Christensen back to remind us, but I think we have every reason to think that the sex is consensual. Yeah. So there's really complicated feelings going on with Helen, and I think that Emily Wilson is bringing that forward again, not surprisingly, bringing that forward. It just in the simplicity of the word choice that she's using, and then of course in the more complex discussion that she's having about that word choice later, she's bringing that forward in a brilliant way. And so, yeah, was Helen there? Did she like Paris and like, oh, I'm going to have a fling? Or was she kidnapped? And I know that's a debate that has happened in antiquity with different people, different philosophers and what have you, leaning on one side or the other. But I similar to the Achilles and Patroclus, is it ambiguous on purpose? Is Homer just that good at what he's doing? Is like, I'll let you guys think about this, or I'll give you some clues and you do with them as you will. I would say that the Achilles and Patroclus being lovers is less ambiguous than what Helen's state of mind is. And again, Helen does not get a lot of screen time, in air quotes, screen time in the Iliad, obviously. But when she does show up, she's worth listening to. And it's really interesting, right? Like, keep talking, Helen. Like, you're still on the scene here. What's going on with you? This is interesting. I wish we saw, there's a lot of things we could wish for in the Iliad, especially when it comes to women. But it would have been really interesting to see more of Helen and to hear more of her, more of what she would have to say.
No, the Helen of the Iliad and the Odyssey is a long-standing obsession of mine, because I also think she's so different in the Odyssey in this really interesting way. But in both cases, she just like the level of agency that she seems to have despite like the rest of what we know or don't know about her story, and yeah, this question of like whether she went, like I mean I feel like I've landed on the side of I don't think we'll ever. I mean, I could go into the depths of, well, there's also no way to know. It's a mythological, it's one of those things where
Right.
some people, like maybe at the time of the Homeric epics, they thought one thing, and then 300 years later, they thought another. And so we can never have like a cut and dry answer. But I think, yeah, there's a lot to be kind of looked at and why certain sources suggest one thing versus another.
Mm-hmm.
But the like Homeric Helen definitely seems to be fairly like in control of her destiny in a way that like most other women don't tend to be, particularly outside of the Homeric texts. Like the women in Homer have a lot
Mm-hmm.
more general agency than women in most other myths, which is another interesting thing in itself. But Helen specifically, I think, is, I don't know, a complete enigma.
Yeah. Well, and again, good for Homer for giving us this to talk about, because
Mm-hmm.
she could have been a very cookie cutter black and white, like just I, the example I would think of is Chryseis, the kidnapped daughter of Chryses, who lives in the town of Chryses, and I'm like, okay, no one was thinking too hard about this family. They were just like, we need a priest of Apollo who has a daughter and he lives in a town. Let's just give them all the same name.
Yeah,
That's
nice and simple.
yeah, that's pretty cookie cutter. Um, uh, Helen, thankfully, is given a little bit, or yeah, only a little bit, unfortunately, but a little bit more to do than that. And that actually, I think maybe you're already familiar with this research, but it what you were just saying about the autonomy and or I think you said agency
Mm.
with Helen. So related to what you've been talking about with Helen, and also we can easily pull Penelope into this. Marguerite Finkelberg has a book called Greeks and Pre-Greeks, Aegean Prehistory and Greek Heroic Tradition.
Hmm.
And she makes this brilliant argument. It's one of those things that as soon as you see it, you're like, oh my gosh, how did I not see that for myself? That's so clever. She makes this brilliant argument that it sure looks like in late Bronze Age Greek society that you had to marry a queen to become a king.
Mm.
Right. So that's how
Interesting.
Menelaus, that's how
Yeah.
Menelaus becomes king of Sparta, because Helen is the queen of Sparta.
Mm-hmm.
And we can go to Penelope, and well, Odysseus's father Laertes is still around, and
Mm-hmm.
his 20-year-old son Telemachus is around, and neither of them are the king. And that's because to be the king, you have to marry the queen. And that's why all the suitors really want to marry Penelope. Well, that's obvious. They want to marry her to become king of Ithaca. But more subtle is that's why Laertes is not already the king. And that's
Yeah.
why Telemachus can't just become the king, even though he's of an age to do so. And there's a handful of other examples, but she discusses this and says, well, is this reflecting a late Bronze Age tradition where indeed a kingship was not necessarily hereditary? It wasn't the son of the king who became the king, but it was the husband of the daughter.
Hmm.
And so going back to my to where to the area that I'm more familiar in Anatolia, that system is not explicitly described, but there are several situations where it kind of looks like maybe that is going on, right?
Hmm.
So in the very early stages of the old Hittite kingdom, it looks like they have what's kind of called an avuncular system of kingship, which is a little bit complicated. But basically, it means that, yes, there's a royal family, but it's not necessarily the son who becomes king. It's often the male cousin of the son. So, in other words, the kingship is kind of zigzagging back and forth. It's
Yeah.
staying within one family, but it's zigzagging around. And also in the Hittite kingdom, there was this title called Tawanana, which was the title of the queen. And it was, again, this is a little bit fuzzy. We only have a couple of texts to talk about this, and so it's fairly speculative. But it kind of looks like once you're given the title of Tawanana, the queen, you don't lose it, right? So your
Hmm.
husband could die, and a new king could come out and have a new queen, but you're still the Tawanana. And so that's really
Interesting.
interesting. And then we could go over to Western Anatolia, where Troy was, or still is for that matter, and where we have Luwian speaking people. There's some really interesting research now, or not now, but in the last 15 or so years, saying, well, yeah, the Luwians were clearly there, but there were other people there that we call the proto. So we have the Lycians in, the Lycians are in, that's Glaukos and Sarpedon in the Iliad, but what is more likely is the Lycians are an Iron Age people, but they had to come from somewhere. So what Hittitologists call the Proto-Lycians, they're living over there. We have a group of people called the Carians who are speaking another language and all of the Hittite, Proto-Lycian, Carian, Palaic is another, and then Luwian. They're all related languages, right? They're all what we call Anatolian languages. So they're all sibling languages to one another. And then we see Lycian appears in the Iron Age, I think is the only one. Oh, and Lydian. Lycian and Lydian are the only languages from that family to make it into the Iron Age, as far as we can tell.
So interesting. I know those names as like in all of the myths and the epic, and like, so there are all these, names I've heard 1,000 times, but not thought of them as, it's so hard between that difference between like Greek mythological like regions and like the actual, there's always such a kind of a fuzzy line. That's really,
absolutely.
That's so interesting.
And also a fuzzy line from the Iron Age to the late Bronze Age, right? So these people living in Western Anatolia, the Trojans and their neighbors, were politically very active. We only know this because the Hittites wrote about it, right? The Hittites had to go beat them up a bunch of times or make treaties with them. They did write for themselves. This is really interesting. They did write for themselves, and we only have a handful of very small examples of it. And the only examples we have are diplomatic texts that they sent to Egypt. And we have them in what's called the Amarna archive of ancient Egypt. And there are these clumsily written, they're written in Hittite, which is not the language that the writer would, it's related. It's like Spanish and Italian. It's related to the language that the speaker would have spoken, but not their native language. But they knew that the Egyptians would only understand Hittite, right? And actually the Egyptians, or the Hittites, when they communicated with the Egyptians, they used Akkadian, which is kind of the lingua franca back then, right? So it's really, really complicated. So anyway, so the picture that we have is we have these Western Anatolian people who are just barely familiar enough with writing to send documents to the ancient Egyptians saying, will you help us fight the Hittites? They're a bunch of jerks. So they did write for themselves, but we don't have any archives. We don't, and maybe we will someday. That would be incredible. That would be so exciting. But we don't have anything from them other than these very small handful of diplomatic texts. But we do have the Hittites talking about them all the time. Lots and lots of texts, like they're annoying. The people of Apasha, which becomes Ephesus, or Melawanda. Melawanda becomes Miletos, right? So we and then I'm sure you're familiar with this, or maybe have had others talk about it. But Troy is called Wilusa, right? And then and this is a little bit unclear, but it looks like the city of Troy is called Wilusa, which if you drop the L is where we get Ilios, the Greek word Ilios, and then of course Iliad from. And then the region around Troy we think is called Taruisha, which could be where the word Troy comes from. And that's why there's these two different words for the city of Troy. It is both Troy and Ilios because, well, that's the region and the locality, right? And so the Hittites are writing about all these things. And going back, all the way back to the Finkelberg argument that maybe you have to marry the queen to become the king, what little tiny glimmers we can steal from dynastic disputes in Western Anatolia, there's one or two examples, and it is pretty minimal. So I could be, reaching a little bit too hard here, but there's a few examples where the son of the king does not become the king, but somebody else becomes the king. And like, okay, well, maybe it's because they were usurped, or who knows what happens. But when you collect all this data and you go back to Finkelberg and say, in Greek mythology, there's a bunch of examples. I just gave Menelaus and Odysseus as examples, but there's a handful of others, and she articulates it really, really well in her book. But yeah, this comes from somewhere, right? This isn't some mythographer just making up. I mean, sometimes for the Odyssey, it is a good plot device. It does provide this tension of like, will he get back, and he's got something to get back to, versus, oh, somebody married Penelope, or they killed Penelope and took over the kingship 20 years ago. So there's a plot element to it, but I think that that's not necessarily the case with Helen and Menelaus, or at least not nearly as easily.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe this pattern that Finkelberg was able to identify is actually reflecting a political reality in the late Bronze Age, where women were queens and you had to marry them. And now, did that give these female queens more power? Well, who knows, right?
Yeah.
We have almost nothing that we can say about the politics of Mycenaean Greece. For example, there's still, I mean, we've known about the Mycenaeans textually since, well, I mean, we didn't know it was Greek until the early 50s.
Right.
So we'll start with that. We knew that the Mycenaeans were Greek-speaking peoples in the early 50s, and we started translating Linear B, you know, the writing system that they write their text in.
Mm-hmm.
But they're all administrative texts. They're like, we sent troops over here. We got grain from over here, and taxes and all that.
Yeah, lots of temple records, lots of just
temple
palace
records. Here's how much oil we have for this goddess, etc. And so the point is, we know so little about Mycenaean political structure that we don't actually know if everyone was a king of their own city, or if there actually was this kind of Agamemnon type person who was king of all of it. We don't know. Now, the Hittites, they call, so their word for the Greeks is Ahiyawa, which is related to Achaean, one of the names of the Greeks in the Iliad. They talk about the great king of the Ahiyawa. So in their language is implying that there is an overarching king. And well, obviously in the Iliad, Agamemnon is not necessarily an overarching king. He's just like the biggest king, right?
Yeah,
the richest and most powerful king.
Like, it's inexplicit in this really interesting way that kind of fits in with that, which is that, like, yeah, he's kind of the leader, but without any kind of explanation for why that would be, or what special power he could hold that makes him the leader. It's just kind of like, he just is, which is kind of the same thing with like why Menelaus becomes king of Sparta. It's just like, well, he marries Helen, and so, well, he just is, despite that being the one of the only like examples of that. So that's really interesting. I mean, I'm utterly obsessed with the ways we can see potential hints at the Bronze Age, like within the mythology, because I think it's there in so many places. So that's just, overall, I didn't know the thing about the queens, and now I will be obsessed for a little bit. So thank you.
Yeah, it's in Finkelberg. I mean, Finkelberg is another genius. There's this list of writers where I'm like, man, I wish I'd thought of that. You're so darn smart, and that's such a clever idea, and you wrote about it so well that that's why you have all the attention. You deserve all the attention that you get.
Yeah.
And so her book is definitely worth reading, and that section on the on is this mythology trying to show us a late Bronze Age political reality. It's just one chapter, and she's got obviously many other interesting arguments and discussions in that book. But yeah, I read that as a grad student. I was like, oh my gosh, that's so clever.
Yeah,
I gotta think about this some more.
Yeah,
and it helps make a lot of sense out of, again, some of these stories, and again, her work. I mean, I would recommend to your audience and to you yourself, if you're curious, all of her work is awesome.
Well, we did a series on the Bronze Age a couple years ago now, and it's one of those things that, you know, what little we know is so fascinating, and there's always those little bits and pieces to learn more, and I always want to return to it. So now I'm already thinking about ways to do that. But thinking of the Mycenaean stuff too, because we for that conversation, or for that series, one of the people I spoke to, what's her name? Oh, Kim Shelton, Dr. Kim Shelton. She heads up a portion of the current archaeological dig at Mycenae, and so was talking to us about some of that stuff. And, you know, this would be city specific versus the broader Mycenaeans, but I'll always remember one of the other things she mentioned. Just there's a lot more evidence for just like representation of women, I guess, like both in these palace records, but also in things like votive offerings that people were given for these like big ceremonies and all of the type of stuff that you get in those wonderful, archaeologist dream trash pits and
Yeah.
stuff like that, where there is so much kind of like really unspecific evidence that there was just more representation of women in this way that suggests that there was at least some closer level of equality compared to, say, later in like the classical period or something. So
Right.
yeah, it's interesting to kind of have those little bits of connection, and generally fascinating. I'm definitely gonna go find at least that article or the chapter that they're talking about. So
Yeah. I mean, again, I can go over to the Hittites and I can say, well, sure, we know quite a bit about several Hittite queens. They were not necessarily expressing political power, right? They weren't leading armies or they weren't designing laws or things like that. But we know a lot about them. And they were given at least enough status that we actually have some of their writing, right? And so from the Hittite perspective, of course, yeah, the queen was definitely not as powerful as the king. And we don't have is it Nefertiti? We don't have examples of a queen who was outright a ruler by herself.
Hatshepsut is the one I think who was
okay, yes,
ruling.
thank you.
Nefertiti was,
right.
I don't think she got full.
Yeah, my Egyptian history is a little bit weak,
Mine
unfortunately.
is very minimal, except for Hatshepsut being the one who was legit a queen of Egypt.
I'm glad you know that, because if I had left it at Nefertiti, some of your audience members would be like, "No, what is he saying?" So I'm really glad you know that. And then another example that I'm a big fan of, but we're going a lot further back now, is Enheduanna, which I'm sure you're familiar with her.
I just I don't. This is the kind of regular social life I lead. Is that I literally having drinks with a friend yesterday, and I was a few drinks in and talking about Enheduanna. So,
well, she deserves to be talked about.
Yes.
She is so fascinating. Granddaughter of Sargon, I believe, granddaughter of Sargon, the first emperor, or at least that we are aware of his history, and an Akkadian person, and a priestess, and the first published author, right? Like her poetry. And I've read some. I teach some of her. I teach a class at the University of Pittsburgh called Mediterranean Warfare. And obviously, Iraq is not exactly the Mediterranean, but it's very, very close.
Yeah.
But I start with her.
Mesopotamia began all of it, so it
counts. Yeah, absolutely.
It counts, yeah.
So I start with her, and we read some of her poems that are about warfare, and I say, here we have pretty much the first, not the first poetry that human beings ever created. Certainly there was oral poetry for who knows how long, right? Maybe as far back as we were able to speak. I certainly can't say. But here we have written poetry, and a female author, which is really exciting. But even in that context, and I'm bringing her up because she's another example of a woman with a voice, right? And presumably more influence than is traditionally ascribed to these societies in this time period. But when I talk about her in my warfare class, I say she's talking about a lot of things, but she talks about war a lot. And isn't that interesting? And I'm like, it actually makes a lot of sense. Her family came to power because her grandfather was awfully darn good at war.
Yeah.
And war is happening all around her. So yeah, it makes sense that that's something she would talk about. But it's fascinating to me that it's part of the argument that I make, that war is such an unfortunately human condition, or a human activity is well, for some it's a condition, for others it's an activity. That our earliest authors are writing about, or the earliest a story, right, told by humankind, that is Gilgamesh, right? And he's he's an awful dude, especially in the beginning of Gilgamesh, and then he's killing bulls of heaven and forest guardians and whatnot. And then we have earlier texts of Gilgamesh that don't show up in what's the more traditional, the standard Babylonian. What you when you go to a bookstore and you pick up a copy of Gilgamesh, it's usually the standard Babylonian version. Well, there's earlier versions.
Yeah, like thousands of years earlier, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
2100 BC, give or take.
That's so wild.
Probably commissioned by a Sumerian king called. So this is actually after Enheduanna, a little bit, a couple hundred years after Enheduanna. And they're about war, right?
Yeah.
Oh, and actually, since we were talking about the Iliad, let me just give one quick example. So, and they're all really short. They're like short Gilgamesh stories. And what we think probably happened is there were a whole bunch of these, and then somebody later compiled them together in what's called the Old Babylonian version of Gilgamesh. And then that was kind of done again several hundred years later, 1300. We don't actually know for sure. We do know the author, a guy named Sin-Lekiunini, puts together the Gilgamesh stories once again, probably leaning heavily on the older collection, but adding some new things. And that's what we all read. But anyway, going all the way back, we have this Ur-3 dynasty is what it's called. So the Sumerians are in charge, and with Sargon, the Akkadians are in charge, and then the Sumerians come back. And when they come back, Shulgi is one of their kings, and he says, "I am the brother of Gilgamesh," which is a very propagandistic thing to do. It would be like somebody today saying, "George Washington is my brother." Right?
I mean, the Greeks did it with everybody.
Oh, they loved connecting themselves to ancient heroes, right? So and the Sumerians were no different. And so because he's making this propagandistic statement, he's trying to connect himself, he's commissioning, we think, these short stories to be written down, right? And so one of them is, it's called Gilgamesh and Akka, A-K-K-A, sometimes Atta, A-T-T-A. And Akka is the king of Kish, and Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, as we expect him to be. And Akka brings his army down, and he besieges the city of Uruk. And Gilgamesh has to stand at the walls of the city in his glorious splendor, his terrific martial might. And he looks so frightening that he actually scares the army of Akka away. And that is just like when Achilles stands at the trench of the Greek wall and he scares the Trojan army away.
Yeah.
Right? And so some scholars have said, oh, that's the same thing. Like the Iliad knows that story and is using it to make itself better. I'm sorry, though. What were you going to say?
No, it's just there's more than that, too, right? Because, like, I mean, even just the Gilgamesh and Enkidu, like, there are Patroclus and Gilgamesh vibes in there too, right? Like there are
completely.
Yeah, these like it's it's interesting to think of it as like an identical thing, or just the nature of these stories and these cultures and how much time gets passed and how many people talk to each other that just like these things end up being so similar. It's I've talked about the Patroclus connections before with Gilgamesh, so hearing that one too, that's interesting.
Yeah, well, and no, absolutely, Achilles and Patroclus and Gilgamesh and Enkidu is right there in multiple different examples. But what's really curious to me about the Gilgamesh, Akka, and I guess you would call it Achilles and Hector, because Hector is leading the army that runs away in the Iliad, is that the text of Gilgamesh and Akka was probably written down for the first time in 2100 BC. We have the most recent copy of it that we have is about 1800 BC, and that's it. Wow. So it basically got replaced. That tradition or those stories got replaced by the Old Babylonian version of Gilgamesh, which then itself got replaced by the standard Babylonian version. And we just don't have any evidence of people talking about or writing down the Gilgamesh and Akka story. Now, they probably were, right? The fact that we don't have it doesn't mean it didn't exist. It just means we haven't found it or it's been destroyed. But let's say that 1800 BC, these latest versions of that text are the last ones. Well, how on earth did Homer get his hands on this story or maybe one of Homer's predecessors, right, in the oral tradition? How did they get their hands on the story and to incorporate into the Iliad? It's just this fascinating question. And also, why? Why did they choose? Now, I think the why is easier to answer. My opinion on the why is, well, Gilgamesh was actually, people were writing Gilgamesh down as late as like the 8th and 7th century BC up in Nineveh, right? So Gilgamesh and the Iliad actually have some a little window where they're contemporaries, right? They
Mm-hmm.
coexist as written documents, if our estimates for the Iliad are pretty good. And so over in Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh was alive and well, so to speak. Were
Mm-hmm.
still active. Now we don't have anything much after. Basically, when the Persians come in, it looks like they weren't as into Gilgamesh, and so it was the Assyrians were the last people to really share the story and get excited about the story. But it makes perfect sense that the Iron Age Assyrians and the Iron Age Greeks had enough awareness of each other that, oh, this Gilgamesh guy, he's really cool, and I'm in the Homeric tradition. I'm a bard who is singing the story of Troy, singing the Iliad. And it's pretty good the way I have it now. But boy, that Gilgamesh story is. Can I cook that into my story somehow? And that, to my mind, that's almost certainly what happened, right?
Yeah.
That the story was moving around the Mediterranean, and different people were like, oh, I already got a good story, but I can make it even better. I can give you another quick example. When Diomedes he chases Aphrodite, so he beats up Aeneas, the Trojan, Aphrodite's son, and she comes down to save him, and he chases her off, and he throws his spear, and I think it kind of graces across her wrist, yeah. And so she drops Aeneas, and she flees to heaven, and luckily for Aeneas, Apollo comes and saves him. So she flees to heaven, and she goes to this really interesting scene. She goes to Zeus and Dione, and she says, Mom, Dad, this jerk hurt me. And they say, well, you shouldn't be going to war anyway. And they calm her down. Well, so Homer is telling us in that scene, well, Zeus and Dione are Aphrodite's parents.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Hesiod tells us that, I don't know if I would call it parentage, but
oh, my listeners are very well versed. I will say we do call it the castration foam.
Yeah, there you go. So
she was born of the castration foam.
A less traditional form of parentage, but her dad is kind of Ouranos, right?
Yeah.
Or the severed testicles of Ouranos, right? And so that's what Hesiod tells us. And Hesiod and Homer, again, roughly contemporary. Mm-hmm. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why is Homer breaking with Hesiod on this? Because he's more or less in sync on a lot of these other traditions. And in this world building sense, they're more or less in sync with one another. And the key to that is, in my mind, is Dione, Dione. Mm-hmm. She is not a goddess that we don't see her again in the Iliad. And I think she shows up maybe one other, she almost never shows up. And so what scholars have determined is, well, Dione is actually just a feminine form of Zeus.
Yeah,
right? Because when Zeus is in the nominative, it's a zeta. But in any other, when Zeus in ancient Greek, this is when Zeus isn't the subject of the verb, his name shows up as a delta. So the D in Dione is actually if we want to get really, really technical, it's the feminine genitive declension of Zeus is Dione. Now, why Homer or one of his predecessors went all the way down to the genitive, I couldn't tell you. I'm not really sure. But basically, Dione is there's Mr. Zeus and Mrs. Zeus.
Yeah. But it's really, if you think about it, it's like God and goddess, right?
Yeah, because
Dios also just means God. Like, it's Zeus, but it's also just God. Like,
well, yeah. I mean, so the etymology for his name goes back to brightness. And so, yes, Mr. God, Mrs. God, but we can get even more specific and say, like, Mr. Shining, Mr. Brightness, and Mrs. Brightness. And in Gilgamesh, I want to say it's tablet 6, I believe. Ishtar, the Akkadian goddess of love and war, she goes to Gilgamesh. She's like, I think you're pretty cute. Can we get together? And he says, no, you're insane for thinking that. Get out of my face, which never good to be rude to anybody, but very unwise to be rude to a powerful goddess. And so what does she do? She goes up to heaven and she goes to her mom and dad and her mom and dad are Anu and Antu, Antu being the feminine form of Anu. And
Wow.
Anu and Antu are the sky gods,
Yeah.
right?
Wow.
And or I think maybe more accurately the sun god. Well, yeah, I have to. Man, there's another example where I'm like, oh, maybe I should have done some homework before I did into this. But they are, so Zeus and Dione are the stand-ins for Anu and Antu, and
Yeah.
Ishtar, the goddess of love, yes, goddess of war, but for
But
this situation,
yeah.
goddess of love, is the stand-in for Aphrodite, a goddess who is insulted by a mortal, and she goes up to Mr. and Mrs. Sky God to complain about it. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh my gosh, okay, so there's another example of Homer or some Homeric tradition bard saying that's a great story. I'm going to cook that into my Iliad because, and it could easily get away with it because I think Diomedes is fascinating. He beats two gods in battle, which is, well, he doesn't really battle Aphrodite. She's actually doing a really kind thing to save her son, but he beats Ares in battle. So I'm a big fan of Diomedes, but he doesn't progress the plot of the Iliad at all, right? He's just a guy who's also good at fighting. If you took Diomedes out, the Iliad would be a little bit shorter and maybe a little bit less interesting, but it would carry on just fine.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you are this Greek, or if you're this bard who wants to like add stuff to the story, Diomedes is a great choice because he's just hanging out anyway, right? You can't mess with Achilles too much because he's got to do what he's got to do, and
Yeah.
maybe you shouldn't mess with Agamemnon too much, and you can't mess with Hector too much. But Diomedes, like, he's just like this cool side story. And if you want to like spice up your Iliad, yeah, bring some Gilgamesh and throw it onto Diomedes.
Yeah. I'm so thrilled to know that because, one of the, given my work, one of the things I deal with most is people wondering, like, well, less so now because I think I've drilled it into my listeners' heads, but wondering what the, like, quote unquote correct version of something is. And Aphrodite's parentage is one of those things where people get
Yeah.
so thrown, like, why does this place say this
Yeah.
and this place say that? And I just have to sit people down and be like, I'm really sorry, that's just the way it is. Both are right, and also neither are right. Like, and so but the Zeus and Dion being her parents has always thrown me a little bit, and like fairly recently I learned or made that connection that the name Dion is also just Zeus, but knowing this, that the scene so like closely mirrors that Gilgamesh,
Yeah.
like, that's so interesting because it's also, if I recall, but maybe not, maybe less so. Either way, Aphrodite is one of her storylines and her kind of characters is one of the places where the Iliad and the Odyssey are most like they contradict each other, because like in the Iliad, Hephaestus is married to, I believe, Aglaia, and then in the Odyssey, he's married to Aphrodite, and it's another one of these sort of funny, like, oh, we're supposed to believe this is by the same, like, quote unquote author, but they also contradict each other in these ways. And I think there might be some reference to Aphrodite's parentage not being, but maybe I'm making that up, not being Dione. But either way, it's just one of these interesting examples, yeah, of like where it diverges so much from the wider kind of understanding. That's so interesting.
I love it. I love imagining these bards like, oh, I'm just going to keep adding to this. And so when Homer or whoever actually writes it down, it's just this big, beautiful in many parts, but kind of ungainly in some other parts, collection of hundreds of years of people saying, oh, this would be good to add.
Yeah.
To your point about what is correct and what is not correct, I found a lot of success in talking with my students about this and saying, well, think about comic book movies, right? So how many origin stories has Batman? How many times have we seen Batman have an origin story? And same thing with Superman. And we don't mind, right? Like a new Superman movie comes out, a new Batman movie comes out, and we're like, let's do it. Let's start all over. Let's start from scratch. And so I think the Greek mythology is the same way. They're all just riffing on these traditions that that they've inherited, and sometimes they play it really straight, and they're like, I'm not going to mess with this. I'm going to tell it again, but I'm going to tell it the way I was told. And then sometimes they're like, oh, I'm going to take it over here to the left a little bit. And so, because students often kind of struggle with like, well, isn't it cohesive? Like, didn't all the Greeks believe one set of stories and have the gods have one set of powers and personalities? I'm like, no.
Not even a little.
if you go read like Bullfinch or something, you might walk away thinking, oh, this is actually pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
Not to pick on Bullfinch, but
That's
if you
fine.
go read yeah, if you go read somebody's collection of Greek myths, you could say, or I was sucker for Deliriers when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean to pick on Delir, love that guy, but a lot of people are presenting it as a pretty cohesive story, and it is much more like Superman and Batman, where it's just been told over and over and over again, and each new teller is adding their own spice or aspects of their own that culture's time period, and they even did it forever, right? So we can start with Homer if we want to, and we could end with, I'm trying to think of the latest mythographer I can think of, Apuleius, somebody like, we could end 1,000 years later.
Yeah.
And they're just still riffing on these stories until obviously the Romans take over. Although I think Apuleius was a Greek, but anyway, in a Roman world.
No, it does go on forever. That's the best way. Yeah.
Well, and Madeline Miller.
Yeah.
We're still doing it 2,700 years later. And Song of Achilles, if you like, I'm sure you've read it. Maybe I'm trying to remember if I've heard you talk about it before. I think I have actually.
It really early on, but yeah. I still have people who read it because of me and then send me lovingly horrible messages about how much they're crying because of me.
Oh my gosh. That one, I'm waiting for. I think she wrote a short story that came out most recently, but Song of Achilles and Circe are just. If you're a Greek mythology fan, oh my gosh, go read the audience. You got to read them immediately because it's really good writing, really well told, really emotional. Patroclus is like the narrator for Song of Achilles. It's just such a. You just feel for that guy.
Yeah, I have to say Circe is not my favorite, but Song of Achilles, I really,
interesting to hear you say that. I was a sucker for Circe, and I watched an interview with Madeline Miller on YouTube or something, and she said, I purposely put Odysseus into Circe proportionally for the same amount of time as Circe was in the Odyssey.
Ooh, that is
nice. What a nice little choice that you made there. Like, okay, good. Of course he's in the story. That's pretty much why we know about Circe, but like, only do what you need to with that guy.
Yeah,
right.
No, and I should say I don't dislike it at all. I think what she was trying to do with it was not necessarily what I wanted from it.
Interesting.
I also I've become I have a lot of trouble doing any kind of reception these days because my life is so deeply entrenched within every ancient source and sticking to those ancient sources that I sometimes just don't find the same appreciation of reception these days because I'm either overthinking every choice they made and wondering why they made it, or with Madeline Miller it's a little different because I know that if she made a choice it was very intentional, but there's a lot of other authors who are doing this from a less knowledgeable background, and that's fine, but it leaves me going, oh, why did they do this? Was that on purpose or was it just a choice and things like that. So I've just notoriously fallen off of really talking about much reception too, just because it also I love that it exists and I'm so happy for it, but it's also one of those things that just I don't know, it doesn't scratch the right part of my brain, I guess. I like it, but I like the sources more.
Well, yeah, I agree. I could talk about the Iliad as much as I like Miller's work. I am fascinated by the Iliad, right? So I agree with you, but I almost wonder if you're like the director who can't watch other people's movies because you see all the flaws.
No, a little, honestly. A little. It just in that way where, and I've just come to terms with it, and I kind of joke about it a lot. But it's also partially that I don't get the same enjoyment out of it because, regardless of how I want it to feel, it will feel like work, but not like work. Just in this way where my brain will obsessively pick up every single thing that either is or is not from a source. And it just makes the whole reading process less fun. And that's simply the nature of my brain after 8 years of living within these sources like I do.
Right.
So, I'm not complaining, but it is kind of, it's become an interesting thing. Circe is one of the, because it was so long ago now. I read it when it came out too, but so I might also be misremembering things or whatever. But yeah, and now there's just so many of them too where I'm like, I love it. Great. Bring everyone into the Greek myth. And then they can come find me.
Yeah. Speaking about choices, so I was familiar with what comes next after the Odyssey, right? The weird kind of Telemachus.
That's my Telemachus
marries Circe, and then Telegonus marries Penelope. And I was, in my mind, I was like, well, that's part of the story too. What are you going to do with that? And I'm reading through, and it's everything's going smoothly. And then I'm like, well, the story could end here. And then she's like, well, there's another chapter. I was like, are you going to go for it?
She
Are you gonna
did.
are you gonna sell this idea that there's this weird swapping of sons and wives?
No.
And I was like, oh, I would have quit. That's a weird story that does not need to be told, but she went for it. And I will say this, she did it as well as it could have been done,
Yeah.
but it probably could not have been done well.
Yeah. No, I've turned that very, like, just the very existence of the telegony into like a running joke on my show, which is that I will not on this podcast, the telegony doesn't exist.
There you go. All right.
Even though I can jokingly refer to it in such a way, but I will never cover it in detail because in my head it doesn't exist. It's the most absurd thing. Actually, I'm the project. I'm not sure if I said it in any of our emails, so apologies. But the project I'm neck deep in is a children's retelling of the Odyssey that's coming out next year, and so I've been in all of this very deep. And at one point, we were talking about the ending with my editor, and my biggest sticking point is that I am. This book is for like 8-year-olds, but I am sticking as true to the source material as I can, and I'm fighting a lot of battles for it. But at the end, it obviously ends in this pretty bizarre kind of way. Like it's very like a Greek play before Greek plays, where the gods come in and they're like, this is the only way we can solve this because you did actually something so terrible that there's nothing that we can do except be like, it's fine now. But then my editors was like, oh, is there like some way we can kind of like wrap it up, like some kind of like ending? And I was like, we can kind of imply, but here's what actually happens if you want like the full blown end game of Odysseus and Penelope. So I like telling her very jokingly, I'm like, I'm not touching that with a 20-foot pole, but here's why we're going to be a little subtle with like what level of ending we give.
Yeah. An idea that I hear frequently, and I have to agree with, is that the reason we have the Iliad and the Odyssey and not the other parts of the cycle is because they were the good ones.
Yeah.
And they were the ones that got copied down the most because they were the ones that everybody liked.
Yeah. Well, it's like the plays, right? That's true of the plays.
Yeah.
Except for the elephant. I almost said elephant. Well, I did. Alphabet plays, other than the Euripides alphabet plays. Like, yeah, it's just the ones that everybody liked enough to teach in school and copy down for 2,000 years. Plus.
I mean, I wish we had them all. I would read them eagerly, but I suspect I would be like, oh, maybe this is why it didn't get copied as much.
Yeah. No, it's always so interesting. Well, okay, I feel like we've talked so much about all of these different elements of the Iliad, but just with what little time we have, I'm curious if is anything that you really took out of your research on it, or kind of anything else that you want to talk about.
Yeah, I can speak really quickly. I think my book, Fatal Second Helen, tried to, even though it's not that long, try to do several things. And the thing that the one thing that I would hope people would actually walk away from it is a recognition that the Iliad could be read as anti-war. And my support for that is that, and we touched upon this a little bit earlier, you've got the two most, you said very intelligently earlier, the Iliad isn't really about good versus evil. Achilles isn't good, Hector isn't evil, and vice versa. It doesn't work that way, and it wasn't, I think, supposed to work that way. When I teach it, I say, well, let's think about who is relatable and who is not relatable. And for me, Hector and Patroclus are the relatable guys. Hector takes his helmet off. Yeah, Hector takes his helmet off to comfort his baby son, and
Hector is the best character in the Iliad. I think that argument is pretty sound.
He's defending his home from invaders. Yeah. I tell people I wouldn't. So I have 3 sons, 11-year-old twin boys and a 7-year-old boy, and I'm like, I don't know that I would tell my sons to be exactly like Hector, because in that same scene where he takes his helmet off, Andromache says, well, if you get killed, we'll be enslaved and raped, and your son will be killed. And he says something like, yeah, but I'll be dead. So it's like, oh, Hector, why did you?
The
I mean,
ancient world is
that's
still the ancient world.
yeah, exactly. And that's a brutal paraphrasing. Obviously, it's
Yeah.
more nuanced than that. But he essentially says, well, if that happens, I'll be dead. So like, I'm not going to know about it.
Yeah.
But these two characters who we can see as people, Achilles is not a person. He's like a killing machine, right?
Yeah.
These two people that Homer is trying hard to show us as actual people with depth. The last third of the Iliad is about their murder and their funeral.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, oh, that's and the book ends like rather abruptly with Hector's funeral. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
that's on purpose. There's so much more story to tell, right? We just talked about it. We know how much story there is to tell. Homer could have kept on going, even just one or two more stories if he wanted to, but he obviously he ends with the death of Hector, and the tamer of horses. I forget
Mm-hmm.
how Wilson trains it, but essentially Hector, a tamer of horses. Thus was buried Hector, tamer of horses. The last line of the Iliad,
Mm.
very, in my mind, super intentionally. And so my take on it, and what I try to write about, is Homer is kind of rubbing our noses in this idea that good war kills good people.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that war benefits, the Achilles's and Agamemnon's, they are not good people. And I'm fascinated by that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I have to be very careful with trying to impose interpretations on ancient authors, especially something like the Iliad, which had who knows how many authors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when I read it, that's the message that I get. Like, I like Patroclus, I like Hector, and they both die badly. Well, everybody who dies in the Iliad dies badly, but they both die badly, and when Patroclus dies, everyone's crying in the Greek camp. When Hector dies, everyone's crying in Troy. And the final third of the Iliad, you could say, oh, it's the Aristeia of Achilles. It's when Achilles just turns it on and just wrecks the Trojan army single-handedly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that happens. That's interesting. The action movie part of me does enjoy watching that or reading that. But that's not what the last third is about. The last
No.
third is about the death and burial of two. You can maybe throw Priam in here as well, but really the only two good people of the Iliad. And even Priam gets his moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
We see that guy basically two times in the Iliad. We talked about the Tychoscopia. He's comforting Helen. He's being like a sweet father-in-law to Helen. Um, and then he is kissing the hands of a man who killed his son, right? And weeping with Achilles. So I'm like, okay, the good people, everyone's miserable.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone in the Iliad is miserable, but the good people are dead. And the people who are supposed to be maybe Agamemnon's the least miserable. He's actually probably like, oh, this actually worked out quite well for me. But
But at the same time,
pretty
we're
much
still
everybody
supposed
else.
to know what happens to him after, which I think
Yeah,
is
well,
kind of part of that too.
that's another great point. Is
Yeah.
if we go to the Nostoi, the returns, yeah, I mean nobody. Menelaus kind of does okay, right? But nobody else. It doesn't go well for anybody else. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what happens to Idomeneus. I think he gets. I forget all the different
Yeah.
examples of what
Yeah.
happens to people, but it takes Odysseus 10 years and lots of terrible adventures, and Agamemnon gets killed in his bathtub, and so
Menelaus gets sent to Egypt even. Like he still has like it
yeah,
takes him like 6 years or something. Like
it's all they have to do is cross the Aegean Sea,
yeah.
and it's just really really difficult. And so I think that the Iliad in particular is a very well crafted story that, and again, this is my interpretation. I wouldn't go and A, I'm not the first person to think this. B, I'm not going to go and say this is the only way it could be interpreted.
Mm-hmm.
But my book and my interpretation is, yeah, Homer is trying to show you that this is awful. It's
Mm-hmm.
just you're going to finish the Iliad, and there's going to be a little part of you that's, oh my gosh, all the fighting was great, and there's going to be another part of you, if you really did some soul searching and you really thought about what is this saying, how do I feel? You're like, oh man, I don't feel good.
Yeah.
That's a hard ending. That last third is a rough go. And I love that. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's fascinating. And I think that anyone who wants to use the Iliad for a pro war argument hasn't done that soul searching,
Mm-hmm.
or hasn't actually read the Iliad, just
Yeah.
likes to use it as a prop and say we should, whatever, we should be more like Achilles. Anyone that says we should be more like Achilles, I am instantly
Red
very
flag.
suspicious of.
Yeah.
Oh, big time red flag.
Yeah.
And so that's, and again, I bring into the book my experience as a combat veteran, as a United States Marine, and sometimes I'm funny, sometimes I get really deep into the Hittites, but overall, I'm trying to build this argument that, yeah, the Iliad is brilliant and it's wonderful, and it's telling you a really awful story, and I hope that you can see it and maybe think about war a little bit differently because of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a beautiful way of kind of summarizing it, but also a perfect way of making so clear how much it would be of interest, I think, to my listeners, because this is something we've talked about on the show a lot. Because I mean, this has been pretty true, I think, throughout the history of my show. But even just hearing you kind of talk about it in this way, or that what you said about soul searching, and the people who find the pro war just are not, they're either not reading it at all, or they're just not paying attention. And that just reminded me of how it's funny, because this is actually was the original impetus for the conversation I had with Joel, which we recorded like a good year later than we'd planned, but it originally came out of the reaction to Emily Wilson's translation of the Iliad, because the reaction to that translation by this very specific subset of men
Mm-hmm.
was so utterly devoid of like reality, or like any kind of grounding in what the actual Iliad is. And as a woman online in the classics field, and at that time I was still daring X, and was tweeting about this, and
Mm-hmm.
the way that this type of man was reacting to her translating it was this. It just reminded me how many people do still consider these works, not only being pro-war in the Iliad, but also are still like holding on to these ideas of it being, pro-Western civilization, pro,
Mm-hmm.
just like this invention of Europe, whatever bullshit. Like it's so lacking in any kind of reality of the actual text itself, and just gives away so many of the terrors and horrors of our current society, right? Just this assumption that like, because this ancient work that we revere is about war, that somehow means it must be pro-war. And that disconnect has always baffled me, because I read the
Mm-hmm.
Iliad and I see what is happening, and it is absolutely an incredible book about a war, but it is not about war being good. Yeah, like it is
Mm-hmm.
about how even the best heroes in a war are terrible, and not thinking about everyone, only thinking of themselves, like Achilles, and how Agamemnon is, I imagine not a great general in the grand scheme of things. And and even these moments we get, you talked way at the beginning about how we're not seeing like the majority of the people fighting this war. We are seeing these like little heroic battles that
Mm-hmm.
are meant to convey something about like these people in this time. But in every one, it seems so clear to me that like ultimately we are just being shown over and over again how war is complicated and human and terrible and violent and heartbreaking and all of these things. Like it's not about, yeah, it's just about it being like a real human experience, and here is that real human experience. And so I don't know, that's my very long-winded way of saying like that I'm glad to have another example, another book that is looking at this, particularly I
Mm-hmm.
think from written by someone from who was in the military. I think that you're probably going to hopefully have some luck at turning a few heads or changing a few minds on this type of thing, particularly because of how you've come at it, and just by nature of being a white man, which in this case is going to be beneficial to the world for reading this. It's like there need to be more white men talking to the other white men about the problems. So it's just interesting, and I'm glad to hear that's kind of how it ended up through all your research on it. And also I'm glad to hear there's nerdy Hittite stuff, because
Yeah.
that's delightful.
Well, that's really kind of you. I appreciate you saying all that. And yeah, you know, I think those people that you were discussing who use the Iliad as pro-war, I think that is, and you know this better than I do, I would argue, it is a symptom of anti-intellectualism and anti-empathy.
Mm.
And I'm like,
And
oh,
heavy misogyny.
well, which is
They
which
all go together.
yeah, they're puzzle pieces that fit
Yeah.
together, unfortunately, just right. And I'm just baffled. I'm like, so there's people that want to live in a world that is explicitly anti-intellectual, anti-empathy. I'm like, that's insane.
Well,
That's
given the
insane.
rise in AI, I can't say, like, it's just, we got more examples of it every day, but that is apparently,
Yeah.
that's apparently the world those people want to live in. And I can't fathom it. And I also just, I think, like, on the simplest of levels, it's just so unfortunate for everyone because, I mean, again, at the simplest of levels, like, the Iliad is a stunning piece of literature that gives these insights into the ancient world that don't exist elsewhere. And so it is something that, like, should be read, but it is something that should be read with, like, either, you know, either that's the translation is accurate enough or understanding enough, or all of these things need to go into somebody reading it and getting that out of it. I don't know, it's just, it's unfortunate that people can read the Iliad or only know of this fake version of it that feels like pro-war, because the actual thing itself, I think, if someone were to read it as it is, you know, would open up these paths to empathy and this understanding that empathy is inherent in the Iliad. And I mean, especially with, you know, there's multiple people in the last year talking about empathy being a bug in humanity. And I realized, actually, even saying that, that's how Joel Christensen opened our conversation on that, is that he had heard, like, Elon Musk, I think, was on talking to Joe Rogan or some terrible bullshit and talking about how empathy was a bug. And and it's just, that was our impetus for starting that up again, because I think it is so important to talk about how, I mean, one, obviously empathy is so fucking important to humanity, but also that the Iliad is something that shows a great deal of empathy if you're actually reading it.
Yeah, I mean, who was this Homer guy, and what was he going through that this is what he gave us?
Yeah,
poor,
or these
poor
generations
guy.
and generations of oral storytellers. Like,
well, and when you look at, like, and I don't mean to prolong this necessarily, but I'll just say very quickly, the Peloponnesian War, man, that thing seemed awful. I teach that sometimes, and I'm like, everybody, the Persian War is kind of fun because it's, like, really quick and very dramatic. And the sequel, well, not really sequel, but the Peloponnesian War is like a long, brutal slog. And I'm like, these people would have read the Iliad and they would have been like, yep.
Yeah.
That's what I'm living right now.
Yeah. And I mean, well, and again, I mean, we'll make sure we get out before 1, but you just even bringing that up, that is something we've talked about on the show recently too, because the you know, there was just vaguely connected to Homer, but during the Peloponnesian War and the siege of Milos, you know, and right after that, Euripides writes this play about the Trojan women, and that is him looking at the horrors that the Athenians committed on Milos and saying, this is like the horrors that the Greeks committed in Troy. And so it's like, you can see the ancient people acknowledging this within the Iliad, that it is this study of how war is human and also war is horrible, you know. Yeah.
And power is problematic.
Yep. It is. When wielded by the wrong people, which tends to be the people who want the power.
Who want it the most. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Is there anything you want to tell my listeners about, like, where they can buy the book? I can link to something in the episode's description as well, or anything to read more from you or follow or anything.
That's awesome. Thank you. The website for the book is just veteransiliad.com. And you can download the first chapter there if you want to sample it. And there's also a link to purchase it there. And then a little bit more information about me. And then I've got a series of book events. They're all, well, I just went up to University of Vermont and gave a talk there. But everything else so far is local. So if I'm in local means Pittsburgh. So if you're in Western Pennsylvania, you know, or near enough by, check out that book events, and maybe if you'd like to come see me give a talk about it, I'd be excited to have you in the audience. But veteransiliad.com. Thank you very much.
Of course. No, I'm happy to share. Always happy to have more insights into this Homeric world, but also specifically the more opportunity I have to try to break apart the terrible reach or the grip that right-wing losers have on the ancient world, I'm happy to do it. So thanks for joining for that.
Oh, very happy to support that cause.
Listeners, I really hope you listened to that. I know that the 5-minute intro was maybe a bit much, but it just, with everything going on right now in the US, abducting, kidnapping the president of a foreign country to steal their oil. And I know there's a lot of nuance there. I'm not saying that this guy was a good guy or a bad guy, but I am saying that the US does not get to play world police. Regardless of what the leaders look like, the US doesn't get to play world police. And if they think they do, then somebody else needs to play world police, because it's getting bad down there. And again, like, this conversation was recorded months ago, and we were looking at like when to release it. But then as soon as we had the Curtis Dozier episode ready to go, we were like, oh, well, this is like very well timed. Like, let's look at this broader issue, because while this episode is not specific to white supremacy, like, they're all tied. They're all different sides of the same coin, right? War culture, this idea of war being the thing to solve problems, like, that's white supremacy, toxic masculinity and all of the harm that it bestows upon men. Like, toxic masculinity harms men more than anybody else, and that is white supremacy. It's all tied with the same bow, right? Like, this is all invented by the same men who have been running this shit for 3,000 years, and it's not going well. Like, it historically hasn't gone well for those men or us, and it's not now. And so just this idea that, like, oh, you can't bash all white men, like, get a grip, because if you don't see how this is a problem with the very nature of white men, then you are part of it. Like, if you hear me say things like white men are the biggest threat to humanity's survival, and you hear that as an attack on you, then you are part of that threat. And you need to look inward, because I'm not saying that everyone, and no one is saying that everyone, not all men is not, it's unhinged, right? Because again, not all bears. And yet we are cautious of all bears. Okay? And that's where we're coming from. Evidence-backed. This is evidence-backed misandry, and I'm not taking it back, because, like, until men at large, like, again, I have lots of men I think are really good. A lot of white men who I'm really happy to have these conversations with, because they need to be in the conversation. And it's just, I don't even know what to say anymore. I just, like, the misogyny that is coming out of the male loneliness epidemic, this idea that it is women's problem, that men are not appealing to women anymore, like, that it's somehow our problem. And then there's this podcast clip, that Diary of a CEO shit. I just lurk on TikTok, so I don't know if it is like viral on Instagram or anywhere else, but like, or anyone else's feeds. But like, this shit is terrifying. This is a enormous podcast where two men are talking about how society might need to, quote unquote, step in with, like, by providing some kind of, like, I don't even know, like, they're literally talking like The Handmaid's Tale. They're talking like society needs to give these men women. And it's fucking terrifying. And so until that stops, like, I don't give a shit if one individual white man is offended, because if he's offended, he's part of the problem. So again, if you are listening to this and you are feeling attacked when I point out the facts, look inward. This is not an attack on every individual, but societally, white men are a threat. They commit the most violence against women. They commit the most murders. They commit the most... They are the threat. And I'm not going to apologize for saying it as it is. And again, we need to have this nuance. Like, the fact that I ended this conversation, because again, recorded months ago, I just listened to it just now. And after opening up like one of the most misogynist, like horrible messages I've ever gotten. Thankfully, it was also funny because I don't give a shit about shitty men, but like it was horrible. And then listening to this conversation where I even say to this white man that like, it's really good that you're here as a white man talking about these problems. Like, you can hear how much I am very open to the nuance, and it's the other side that doesn't see that nuance. And I'm so over it. Anyway, I just had to ramble more. So if you got this far in the end, thank you so much. And this stuff is important. And I don't know, like, again, like the entirety of Greek mythology is like so heavily based in like oppression, and while whiteness is a modern construct, it has been placed upon ancient Greece in a way that like is important to talk about. And I'm just not going to look at 3,000 years of history that involves the patriarchy oppressing women and people who don't fit in to that patriarchal structure. I'm not going to look at 3,000 years of history of that and pretend it's not what it is. So I don't fucking know anymore. Let's talk about Myths Maybe is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. I'm really grateful to Joshua for this conversation. It was really good. And yeah, we had a great time. So I hope you all listened and were interested. Yeah, Michaela's going to be back this whole month with some more incredible Herodotus while I wrap up the Odyssey. And then we're going to start an Odyssey reading because you all spoke, and I'm so thrilled that you're keen on it. And I'm going to be back. I think we're going to look at the Trojan women as kind of the reintroduction. It's appropriate. Anyway, where did I even leave off on the credits? I don't even know. My brain is not here right now because of the horrors. Anyway, you can find ad-free on patreon.com/mythsbaby or at the link in the episode's description, along with loads of other fun stuff. I don't know. We're here. We're still going. Back on Tuesday. I am Liv, and I love this shit. I do.